Hello, everybody. Good
Hello.
evening. Hello. I have pleasure to welcome you to our third lecture organized by the International Research Platform Contested Legacies. Today's lecture will be given by Professor Julio Ponce Alberca from University of Seville. Professor Ponce will be speaking to us about General Franco's legacy in Spain and historical memory laws. Julio is professor in contemporary history at the University of Seville. He is also a member of the Real Academia de Ciencias, Buenas, Letras y Nobles Artes of Cordoba. His research interests include political history of the state and its administration, politics and policies, as well as Gibraltar and Spain during the 20th century. Among his core publications is the book Gibraltar and Spanish Civil War 1936-39. And the title of his today's lecture is Franco's Contested Legacy and Spanish Historical Memory Laws. The lecture will focus on General Franco's regime legacy. Professor Ponce will explore the problem how this contested legacy has been tackled by democratic governments in Spain after 1978, after the political transformation following to Franco's death in November 1975 and adoption of the democratic constitution in 1978. There's no doubt that this democratic transformation required overcoming the past. In fact, national reconciliation was a basic and requirement and the first step for a successful political change. And Professor Ponce will focus on the issue how different governments, democratic governments, both socialist and right-wing government, Partito Popular and Alianza Popular, have dealt with overcoming the past. During the lecture, he will analyze two historical memory laws which have faced this contested legacy. The first one in 2007 and the second one in 2022. Okay, I think it's the most important information. But before I give the floor to Professor Ponce, traditionally I'd like to remind you that after the lecture we will dedicate 15 minutes for discussion. It will, of course, coordinated by Professor Pożarlik. And during the lecture, you can write your questions in the chat. Okay, thank you, Professor Ponce. The screen is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to participate in this seminar of this project about contested legacies in Eastern and Southern Europe. I think you hear me correctly without problem, no? Okay, in this lecture, I will try to explore the different elements of Franco's dictatorship legacy and how the democratic regime and the democratic governments have dealt with it. I will focus my lecture in four main points. So the different elements of Franco's dictatorship legacy will be explained in terms of, first, the narrative of the past that was made during the 60s, henceforth, so the last period of the Francoism and the democratic regime. Secondly, I will talk about the lieu de mémoire. We have a very important lieu de mémoire, the the Valley of the Fallen, el Valle de los Caídos in Spain. In the third position, I will talk about the therapies, between quote marks, the therapies about the past and the revolution, how we have faced our past during the democratic regime and the evolution of it, because this is an important issue, the evolution of these policies. And I will finish with an analysis of the historical memory laws, mainly the recent one, the law of 2000 of this year, 2022, that was published in last October. So it's a very, very recent law. I'm going to try to share my screen. Please tell me if I reach the, I'm going to, okay, I think I'm sharing now the screen.
Not yet.
Not yet?
Mm-hmm.
I will try to do it, toda la pantalla.
Okay. Maybe Małgorzata can help you.
Yeah, because I have the whole.
Yes, moment. It's loading.
It's loading because I'm trying to share my. Yeah, I'm trying to share my. I think I'm gonna now. Do you see the screen?
No.
No.
No?
Okay, it's okay now.
Well, it's okay now.
But I upload this presentation, not you. So I have the control.
Well, may I take the control or not?
I don't know. I think.
I have here tomar el control. So I think I have taken the control.
Okay.
Let's see if not, I mean, wow. And now what I have done. Okay, I think I'm sharing the whole screen now.
Yes, now it's okay, perfect.
Oh, now it's okay, the sound and the image, no? So
yes.
That's no problem. So and it's easily for me because I can take the control of the slides and it will be much better. Okay. Well, I'm going to start with a poster. And this is the poster. It was an international encounter or a recent conference celebrated in León, where specialists and scholars discuss about history and mainly about the last research lines on Francoism. First thing we should consider is that in the case of Spain, the national memory is definitely related to the Spanish Civil War trauma. So Spain is a singular or a strange case in Europe because Spain was neutral during the First and the Second World War. And from that point of view, the concept of war that the country has is a civil war between 1936 and 1939. Even though there were two more war periods afterwards. The City Evening War in 1958 in the north of Africa, and the non-declared war in the Spanish Sahara during the first half of the 70s. So back into the poster, what we see is, well, a skull and bones. A skull and bones that are refers to the victims of the Spanish Civil War. And there are also two objects, a padlock and a pencil. The first, the padlock, is decorated with the traditional Spanish flag and the current one, so red, yellow, red. And the second object, the pencil, is decorated with a Second Republic flag. So this is trying to express something. The padlock suggests the censorship and the black period of the dictatorship with this flag, even though it's the current flag of Spain. Meanwhile, the pencil proposes a reminder of culture, education, progress, or to sum up, a positive view of the Second Republic. So therefore, there's an implicit message in this poster. The victim, the skull and the bones, is definitely Republican, not nationalist. And someone who was executed by who? By the Francoism. So not all the victims are considered in the poster, only the victims of one side. And this is interesting to understand the current situation, but we are going to talk about a little bit the different memory policies in Spain. Probably it is convenient, a short, a brief historical approach to understand the contested legacies in Spain. In terms of collective memory, the kickoff point begins with the Second Republic. And that was a political regime characterized by one general objective, the modernization of the country. That was an objective shared by the majority of the population. And in fact, the Republic, the Second Republic, was born as a result of a local election, not a general election, yes, a local election. So the birth of the Second Republic was clearly irregular. It was very, very strange. However, that initial Republican unity gave way to divisions and exclusions. In fact, by February of 1936, the country was deeply divided in two, according, for example, to the amount of votes that were picked up during the election of that month. The coup d'etat of July of this year, 1936, gathered all those against the Republic, that were the army, the church, the owners, but also civil servants and middle class. And the coup provoked a general insurrection as well within the Republic. The Center Republicans were soon displaced by socialists, communists, and anarchists. So the Civil War actually was the result of a double revolution. The coup d'etat is clear that, but also the uprising of the left. The Francoist victory gave birth to a long dictatorship. Even though the hard repression of the early 40s, the long-life regime was capable to gain legitimacy. Mainly when the country was modernized, the economy grew and the middle class was settled. Only after Franco's death, the system could change, not before. Franco's regime was a personal one, and without him, without Franco, the political elite had to look for a new statu quo. Sorry for the coughing. these two images, I think, is a good example of the evolution of the country. On the left, you have the victory parade after the war in 1939. And on the right side, you have a poster of the blooming development of the country. And that means that the views about the past were moved between these two photographs, between this meeting, because they were moved from victory, from the concept victory, to the concept peace. Victory were used in the beginning of Franco dictatorship. That's clear. The historical memory, in fact, the official memory of the Francoism was built by the regime to establish an unique image of the past. That's it. The Francoist forces saved Spain from the communism, also known as the anti-Spain. In other words, the good side of the story, the nationalists, Franco, and the bad side of the story, the Republicans. That was the official memory in Spain, the official memory of the winner, and last during the 40s and even the 50s. However, the consolidation of the regime and the executive agreement with the United States changed little by little, step by step, that memory. And in 1964, that transformation process finished with the celebration of the 25 years of peace. Peace between quote marks, peace, the peace of Franco, but peace anyway. The objective of the new official memory was the consolidation of the regime that has brought economic development to the country. That's it. Industrialization, tourism, and development of a middle class. This contrast in terms of time in Spain, we can find it as well when we see the projection of Spain abroad at that time. Spain was a strange mix of repression but also tourism. So you have two photographs, the protest against the regime abroad, but also a flux of tourists that come to Spain. And come to Spain, they came to Spain with under publicity very, very singular. No? Of the official propaganda of the regime made a slogan, Spain is different. So Spain is beautiful and different between quote marks. Visit Spain, come to Spain, because we are different to the rest of in comparison to the rest of Europe. So the confidence of the regime on its survival for the future was backed up by the relation with the United States, the prosperity and the success of the tourism. Spain could be a dictatorship contested in Europe, like in 1963, when the communist Julián Grimau, when you have a photo of a demonstration in Italy, was arrested and executed for responsibilities during the Spanish Civil War. But also the same country was a destination for European tourists. So the milestone, well, there is a clear milestone, and it was in November of 1975, because history changed. And history changed after Franco's death. This is a photograph of the burial ceremony of the dictator with a military parade. Franco, first of all, was a military, a single military truck as well, and the coffin covered by the flag. After Franco's death, and only after Franco's death, we can talk about the legacy and how to face this legacy, how to tackle with this legacy. And the legacy was not simple. The legacy we have to talk about legacies in plural, because there were several legacies. On one hand, we have repression, demonstrations, and you can see the photographs. Oh, sorry for my voice. You can see the photographs on the upper side, no? The police against the students, demonstrations, and also the right-wing partisans, no, of the Francoism. But also for the majority of the population, for that slow middle class and single middle class, there was a period, mainly during the 60s, of growth of cities, industrialization, and modernization. So that's to say that everything, or almost everything, has changed between 1939 and 1975. And the problem was that the legacies of the dictatorships in terms of memory could be divided in two groups: the inherited alive and the dead people. So the inherited alive, I mean the living people, the survivors. And among the alive, we had the exiles, the opposition, and the partisans of the dictatorship. But also that majority I was talking before, the neutral people, the middle class. And also the dead. The dead, this is a clear photograph about it. This is a mass grave recently opened in Spain. The dead were silent. And at that time, almost nobody paid them attention. They were the awkward guest in the party of the transition, because the objectives at that time, when Franco died, the objectives were seeking democracy, looking for stability, looking for a future, and overall to overcome the past. So the dead victims should remain in the past. With respect to them, sure, but the priority at that time was the alive, the living Spaniards, reds or blues. Okay, when Franco died, the political staff understood that the Francoism without Franco was impossible. So any kind of reforms were mandatory in order to keep the stability of the country, adapting Spain to the context of Western democracy. And in that point, it is convenient to bear in mind that other transitions were also taking place at the same time in Europe. Those were the cases of Portugal or the cases of Greece. But a question arises easily. How to deal with the past? How to manage the legacies of the dictatorship within a new regime, a new democratic regime? At first, some measures were taken. As you can see there, the royal pardon in 1975 and different kind of amnesties between 1976 and 77. It was the way to overcome the past. So measure addressed to living people, to the alive, not to the death, to the alive. And another important point was that the reformist path was that Spain will walk towards the democracy through a reformist path, avoiding any kind of rupture that could provoke instability. In that atmosphere, this is an iconic photograph after the first democratic elections of 1977. In the image, we may see the leader of the Socialist Party on the left and the President Suarez, the leader of the center right. According to our current times, this is a politically incorrect image because of the tobacco in official places. Nevertheless, according to the times, that image was really meaningful, deeply meaningful, because it symbolizes the reconciliation after the Civil War. The right and the left were peaceful, smoking together and sharing the flame of a lighter. And for that simple reason was pretty and deeply meaningful. And in terms of memory, both leaders were agreeing on solve the problem of memory among the alive, among the living people. That is to say, the return of the exiles, the freedom of the opposition, and the legalization of the political parties, and even the Francoist representatives were recycled into democratic shapes or even were retired from politics. And the majority of the population was happy with this perspective of a change without dangerous risks. However, not everything was perfect in that process. And in terms of memory, became a little bit more complicated, the memory in Spain. By that time, terrorist activities were at stake, mainly the extreme left and radical Basque nationalist, so namely ETA. Well, fortunately, the state was resilient enough to endure, to put up, and to win the combat against domestic terrorism. But in terms of memory, this phenomenon is interesting because it caused victims as well. So the problem of memory become more complex in Spain because if there were victims and victimizers during the Civil War and the post-war, also we have another victims and victimizers. There were victims and executioners and therefore closer to us under the democratic rule. That means that the executioners were among us, were alive as well. And this is another memory to deal with. However, the memory for some sectors, mainly in a very general terms, the left, was fixed to Civil War and Francoism, while the victims provoked by ETA remain relatively forgotten. To the contrary, the right-wing parties emphasize the victims caused by the terrorism of ETA. This is an interesting point, and I will back a little bit later. Any case, back into memory and democratic regime, we should underline that the first government, with Felipe González, for instance, during the 80s, took some measures as the recognition of military ranks for those old members of the Republican Army. At that time, there was a policy of consensus about the rejection of the war. Civil War was history to be studied by historians and wider public. But the past should be overcome in order to gain the future. That was the idea at that time. That was the general position of the governments along the last quarter of the 20th century. But in 1996, something changed. And something changed because the Conservative Party, Partido Popular, the Popular Party, won the elections. The left, mainly the Socialist Party, began a strategy of pressure over the government through the past. And this is new. This was new. One of the first claims was a restitution of the patrimony of the political parties and trade unions that lost the Civil War. And the Conservative government at the time, under the presidency of José María Aznar, gave way to it because it was considered a good step towards closing wounds of the war. Shortly after, the associations of historical memory showed up under the support of the left parties that claimed the condemnation of the coup d'etat of 1936. And the condemnation was also approved by the government to close the wounds of the past. And by that time, the Association of Historical Memory, named literally historical memory, claimed for the recovery of the bones of Republicans repressed by Franco regime during the war and after. So we have, since then, since the beginning of this century, of the 21st century, we have two new elements. Confrontation, political confrontation, I mean, against the Conservative Party through memory, and the memory of the died people. Up to during the 20th century, the focus were the living people, the alive, the alive victims, the survivors. But now is the memory of the died people. Until then, memory policies were focused on living people, and now was the turn of the dead. And that's new, and that's will be interesting in terms of memory and what is happening nowadays, no, in the country. Well, between 2004 and 2011, the Socialist Party came back to government and promoted a law, the Law 52/2007, known as the historical, or the first historical memory law. And it was a precedent in Andalusia. In the Andalusian government promoted the first law of historical memory in 2003, under the rule of the Socialist Party as well. That law, the Law 52/2007, it was a law that had three dimensions. The withdrawal of Francoist symbols, as you can see in the photograph, the recovery of mortal remains, and the impulse for a new memory focused on a Republican memory overlapping the historical studies, even overlapping the historical studies. Only the first and the third dimensions were widely developed given its limited costs and its instrumentalization as ideological weapons against the opposition. The Conservative Party has no concrete project about memory, and this is important. The Partido Popular, the Popular Party, only is able to say no or to reject the initiatives of the left, the Socialist Party, but they don't have a concrete, a coherent model or project of historical memory for the country. And meanwhile, the Socialist Party use any kind of critique against the law as a proof of Francoism or even fascism. So those who were opposed to the law were considered, well, Francoists or even fascists. Since then, the memory has, the historical memory, I mean, has played a role shaping historical studies, or in other words, historians must follow certain visions if they do not want to be considered uncomfortable specialists. It has, and it is, a sort of pressure within academic spheres. And now, how does memory try to shape the past? In short, we might make out two basic conceptions. First, in terms of memory, nor in terms of history. The Spanish Civil War was a conflict between black and white. So good and evil, light and dark, the Republic and Franco dictatorship. And there's no nuances in that vision of the historical memory. And secondly, the responsible of the violence and the killings was restricted to the circle of general which was led by Franco. So for that historical memory, the Spanish people do not collaborate with Franco. The people suffered the dictatorship. All the people, or the majority of the country, was a victim. No one cooperated with Franco. So you can understand that under those memory principles, it is understandable the difficulties to write history sometimes, because historical studies show and demonstrate more complexity. History is not a story as a fixed narrative. History is based on frequent revisions, and the memory, to the contrary, is a fixed division. After another period of conservative government between 2011 and 2018, and as always, the conservative government has no project about memory. They only, well, President Mariano Rajoy was the former president, just stopped all the funding for memory, but that's all. They didn't have an alternative plan. And as I was saying, after another period of conservative government, the Socialist Party came back to power. The novelty was that for first time in our recent democratic history, a populist party from the extreme left was part of the coalition government. So that's to say that Gobierno de Coalición, the coalition government we have today between the Socialist Party and Podemos. And now the strategy was the condemnation of Francoism, to condemn also its legacies. And one of the legacy was the monarchy, not only the death or the repression. One of the legacy of Francoism was the monarchy. And also the transition process, because it had been directed by former members of Franco regime. For instance, Adolfo Suárez, who was a former collaborator of Francoism. In other words, the current democratic regime is false from a leftist vision, because in a simple expression, the monarchy came because of Franco, and the transition was a product of that monarchy posed by Franco. Of that situation, you have here a good image, one example. ¿Por qué los padres de la Constitución dejaron a mi abuelo en una cuneta? Which translations, the translation is, why the fathers of the Constitution left my grandpa in a ditch. This is a self-explanatory statement. It's a self-explanatory statement that is very common in populist movements. It's simple. And we must make an effort of rationalization to dismantle it. The first thing is that the fathers of the Constitution, they were not born yet, or were single toddlers during the Civil War. They didn't leave your grandpa in a ditch. And the Constitution is a constitution, but it's not a memory law. So this is a strategy to spread the concept of victimizers. The victimizers not only were Franco and his generals, the victimizers could be also the collaborators of the Francoism, Adolfo Suárez, the first president, and in the case of Juan Carlos, the king, well, is someone deeply linked to Franco as well. So you spread the concept of victimizers. Not only were victimizers those who committed crimes during the Civil War, but also those who are considered partners in the crime of impunity later. The transition from that point of view means impunity. The Constitution is a fake Constitution because it doesn't prosecute Francoism. So the democratic regime is not really a democratic one and should be replaced for another. And the another has a clear name. The third, not the second, the third republic. And it's very interesting that the spreading of the concept of victimizers, because it's also linked with the spreading of the concept victims. We will see later. Lieu de mémoire. This is a very strong, no? Lieu de mémoire. The following. The Valley of the Fallen, with a lot of visits. I remember the lecture of the other day about Chernobyl, no? Well, we have a sort of Chernobyl, and it's very interesting how the people are interested in visiting those places. No? Well, talking about the Valley of the Fallen and the current situation in Spain, the atmosphere around the new law, and I'm talking about the law of 2022, the atmosphere was linked to the removal of the remains of Franco. In fact, in October of 2019, Franco was moved under a white cover by mass media and with the presence of members of the government and so on. The Valley of the Fallen is the main lieu de mémoire of the war, where are buried thousands of combatants from both sides, Republican and nationalist. In fact, was built as a place for reconciliation during the 60s, not during the 50s, but during the 60s, the meaning of the Valley of the Fallen was a reconciliation and mainly overcome an instrument to overcome the past. Today, there are no clear plans for the valley, aside from the flux of tourists, many of them, by the way, non-Spaniards. And the change of the name. No? We have changed the name, now it's Valle de Cuelgamuros, no Valle de los Caídos. It's a new name, it's Cuelgamuros, it has no translation, Cuelgamuros Valley. It's a single change of name. And the options, for this monument goes from the destruction. Some people has talked about the total demolition of the of the monument, till the construction of a museum. By now, the only and immediate consequence of the law, of the current law, is the removal of the remains of the second famous and prominent leader of Falange, who is buried there, José Antonio Primo de Rivera. And it is remarkable that José Antonio is not considered a real victim of the war. And the family has decided to take care of the remains before another spectacle, no? As was organized to remove Franco. They don't want publicity, and they want a private ceremony for the remains of José Antonio. And it's good to remember that even some from some sectors, José Antonio was not a victim of the Civil War. It's true, and the history is clear in that point. José Antonio was executed in November 1936. it was executed by the Republican government after some months in prison. So this is another interesting issue, how we are facing this problem of our main lieu de mémoire. Well, the law is quite recent. And the law, it has a lot of outcomes. For this lecture, I'm going to put on the table 7 main points of this law that has close to 60 pages in comparison to the first law of 2007. The law of 2007 has only 7 or 8 pages. This has close to 60, so it's a more complex law. Yeah? From a theoretical point of view, the law protects all kinds of victims. But if we pay attention to the details of the law, the victims of caused by ETA are excluded. And it's interesting that the law consider victims those caused by the regime, but not during the regime. And I say during the regime because there were victims during the regime that were not caused by Franco and by the dictatorship. Another interesting point is that the concept victims encompasses even the relatives until the 4th degree. So not only a victim is that one who fought or died during the Civil War, but his son, his niece, the grandson, and so on. Encompasses even the relatives until the 4th degree. This is a sort of a spreading of the victims. First, the memory movements spread the concept of victimizers, and now the concept victims has been spread in incredible number. Another interesting point is the history should be written according to an official memory, because since this law, not before, but since this law, there is a risk to be prosecuted or fined if a book or article is considered apologetic about Francoism. And for the historians, we know that this is a very delicate matter, because for a historian, a book is perfectly a scientific outcome of our research, but for another person could be, well, an apology of Francoism, and the historians, the historian should go to trial to demonstrate the innocence. No? And it's a very delicate matter at this point. Another point interesting is that all signs inherited from Francoism should disappear, but not the Republicans. So if you go to Madrid, you can find statues of Francisco Largo Caballero, president of the government during the Civil War, or Indalecio Prieto, who was minister during the Second Republic and during the Civil War, and so on, but not signs of Francoism, or Franco, or a general link to the Francoist side, etc. Memory is also a new form of a political identity. And here there is an interesting link between another identities like feminism, LGBT movements, etc. It's a political identity because from some point of view, if we are spreading the concept of victims, we have victims nowadays among us. My neighbor could be a victim, or my myself or my brother could be a victim, even though we didn't have any idea of the Civil War. But my great-grandfather was in the war, or well, a relative, a former relative of me at the war, so I'm a victim as well. And in that atmosphere, the unity between historians, professional historians, is fading away. Because the tendencies of historians have becoming a little bit harsh. Some years ago, when two historians had different point of view, well, they had different point of view, but from a technical point of view. And now the politics is at stake, sometimes between the discussions of historians. Even during the last conference I was in León, that could be very, it was remarkable. Some of the discussions were not this technical discussions between historians. Some of them, only some of them, were actually political discussions. No? And it's fading away as well the unity, the former unity between historians and memory associations. In fact, the concept of historical memory has been replaced by another, more neutral, or more suitable, I would say, the democratic memory. And the last point, I want to emphasize that the law provides a lot of measures, but economic compensations are not allowed. No one can't claim compensation to the state or to companies or to private associations for what they did during the war. So the compensations are only symbolic. And this is, the law is very clear at that point, because 3 times during those 60 pages, 3 times is very expressive about this point. The economic compensations are not allowed. No? Well, meanwhile, some sectors wonder if the memory is not a tool for confrontation, because this is a good example. This is a very, very recent official stamp made by Correos, the public mail service, in commemoration of the history of the Communist Party. And it was a little bit controversial, this stamp, because the stamps about the commemoration of right-wing parties are not allowed, because this is apology of Francoism. But in this case, is the Partido Comunista, there's no problem. And there's no problem because here in Spain, the Communist Party has a sort of democratic pedigree. No? Democratic pedigree because they were fighting against Francoism and so on. No? And it's interesting as well the colors used in this stamp, because it's the red, the purple, and the yellow, the colors of the Republican flag. The message is very clear. Only added by the green, that is, and I asked, why the green? I asked responsible for this. And he told me that it was a concession to echo, identity, hope. Well, it was a good color to add in that way. So to finish my lecture, what are we talking about? Because probably we are talking about a never-ending story, or a story that from some political parties should not end, never, no? Well, today, currently, the legacy is focused mainly on victims, dead victims. No? So we have made a transition in time from the focus on alive victims, living people, to dead victims, and as the most of people that were living during the Spanish Civil War are dead, not because of the war, because of biological reasons. Now the focus is on the dead relatives, victims. So the spreading of the victims, as I told you before. At this point, I think just as possible hypothesis for the future, I think that new initiatives will take place in the future, because if there is a reform law in the future, relatives will claim in the future, and it's easy to claim. It's easy to claim even you don't have any minimum idea of your relative who fought during the Spanish Civil War. That I'm the great-grandson, and I want a compensation for personal or ideological or whatever reasons. New laws, new memory laws will be written. It's very probable that new laws will be written. Not next year, for sure, but within 10 years is quite probable. Because one main problem we have about memory is that we don't have consensus. And we don't have consensus nowadays, not during the transition. We don't have a consensus between the left and the right about memory. In fact, the right has no project of memory. And this is a mistake by the right. They are only capable to say no or to reject initiatives, but they don't have their own model. And this is also another problem for the political system, because step by step there is erosion or delegitimation of the institutions, the democratic institutions, starting by the monarchy. But not only the monarchy. The structure of the Spanish state, the division of the powers, and so on. And this is very clear in the case of Podemos, who has stated a lot of times an alternative model for Spain, no? Legitimizing the current political system. And also, I wonder if we are not in the starting point or the kickoff of a cancel culture to discredit anyone who is not agree with this kind of memory, who is not agree with the government. You know? In fact, when someone writes something about the war or the Franco, is a very delicate matter in terms of who is going to read you. And well, for finishing my lecture, I can give you a personal anecdote. I found one memory, a manuscript of a former collaborator of Franco, and it was unpublished, so it was very good for me as historian to edit the text and to write a prologue. No? Unfortunately, the University of Seville published the book, and it's a very interesting book because it's another published source. Well, in in the newspapers, in the local newspapers, appeared an article against the publication of that book, because this book was published with public money, and the University of Seville is a public university, and how we dare to dedicate money to publish a book of a collaborator of Francoism. So in that way, I wonder, and I state, I wonder myself many questions, and I state these ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julio, for your very interesting lecture. And now I give the floor to Grzegorz, who will coordinate the discussion.
Yes, well, thank you, Joanna. It was truly fascinating, Julio, to follow your bleeding wound story about mnemonic warfare. Yes, the memory of Franco and Francoism as a kind of mnemonic warfare narrative. Excellent, brilliant explanation of this deeply complex nexus between collective memory and collective identity through conceptual lens of mnemonic warfare. Wonderful. So, of course, I'm sure plenty of questions. So please, now the floor is yours. And may I just recommend you to turn on your microphone and ask questions directly to Julio, please.
Hello, everybody.
Yes, please. Anybody with questions for Julio, please?
Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. I don't know, I don't have a question, but a general reflection on the basis of your lecture. You have directly and indirectly pointed out an important question for me. And the relationship between collective memory and historical politics. I understand that introduction of a memorial life gives the authorities an effective instrument for implanting values and transforming souls and impose symbol. It is not a question of isolated symbols, but the system of idea, image, we should not only permeate public life, but also form the framework of the, I think, of the daily life of all citizens. And this can cause ruptures. Yeah, you said the ruptures, and it's not the question of the ruptures between left and right, but a rupture on the, for me, for the emotional, psychological level within society. It's the problem of individual experience, but it's the problem of victims. You say the victims, and there was who have the right to, I don't know, mourn the victims, loved ones, and their innocent death. And who don't have the right of the past. Is the problem the right of the past? And I don't know, in general, collective memory has unifying function. And the lien de mémoire, in general, it provides a collective identity, yeah? Consolidates, cements a community. And the memory of martyrs, it's most important. It's the problem of in civil war in Spain, but also the revolution in France, for example. And but the memory of the martyrs designates the adversary, yeah? And the evocation provides a group with symbolic capital, but I don't know, the other group, it's deprived of this right, the right of the past, of the victims, and it have the the problem I see that, I don't know, the right to pass is confiscated, maybe confiscated in the, I don't know, but by the law. Where is the law, memorial law? Is confiscated from one part of society, not from the regime. I understand it's not for them, but for the victims. And the result, this part of society, which does not have the right to the past, will seek to recover this confiscated past, yes. And often, I think, the recovery, it's the risk to exist of mythologizing the confiscated past, I don't know, maybe. And one question I have, maybe it's not the question, but I think you can, I think about history of civil war. For me, it's the memory of Franco regime. It's okay, but it's the memory of the victims of the Franco regime. It's the memory of the victims of the revolutionary regime, the Catholics, the priests, the women, and I think, I don't know, maybe it's wrong. A little a memory of Catholics is a part of general memory. A memory of Christianity, a memory of martyrs. It's several level of national past, but to the level of general past. But I don't know, memory of victims Franco regime is the part of the global memory of totalitarianism, yeah. But the memory of the victims of revolutionary regime, the Catholics, I think, it's the part of the general memory of the religious convictions, and we have here in the existential, in the individual experience, not politics, but most individual is the other context, I think. Yeah, it's a general reflection, I don't know, but you said it's a different I'm sorry, my French accent, several level. Yeah, thank you.
Merci pour tes questions. The case of Spain is a little bit singular because it was a civil war, but also with a strong international dimension. Franco was supported by Germany and by Italy, but the Second Republic has to, they didn't have another choice, has to be supported by the Soviet Union. So Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union killed people also in Spain. This is one point. And by the way, the law about the last law about memory, don't talk about that, those countries. And also it's another interesting issue. At that time, the frontiers of Spain were Spain, and Balearic Island, Canary Island, but also the north of Morocco was the protectorate. And there were killings and there were mass graves. But since now they are in Moroccan territory, the government didn't want to know anything. So it was a civil war with an international dimension, okay? And it was a civil war. And the problem is that there were people that changed one and twice offside. They were killing with the nationalists, but killing as well with the Republicans. So it's quite complex because if Franco and the nationalists, they had they impose a terror system in the site. On the other hand, it was not only a revolutionary experience in the side of the Republican. It was also a machinery of killing under the influence of the Soviet Union and the Soviet advisors that the Republican side had at that time. So it's the simple vision of the civil war between, well, Reds and Blues, the army and the people. It's not, that's not true. The army was split in two, and the country was split in two as well. You can find workers and poor people in the nationalist side as well, and in the Republican side, and you can find officers and generals and the elite of the military Spanish army at that time on the Republican side and on the nationalist side. So how to deal with a civil war trauma? I think that the best way is by consensus. Is nonetheless to try to impose one official memory, as Franco did during the 40s. This is the España, this is Spain, the good side and the anti-Spain, the Reds and the communists and the Masonic people and so on. And I think that under democratic rule, the different governments, by Suarez and with Felipe González as well, play a good role during the 70s and the 80s, because there was a consensus about what we have to do. And what we are expecting is a law made by consensus. The two laws we have had of memory laws, there were laws approved only by one side of the parliament. And it's quite complicated, even for the daily life, for the people, but even for the daily life of historians. There are a lot of colleagues of me in the university. I studied the 19th century. I don't want to study the 20th century, and I hate to study the Civil War, the Francoism, because it's a risk. I think this is a disappointing film for a historian. Why we cannot do our work and we don't have memory laws that are necessary memory laws, but memory laws made by consensus. Another point to finish my trying to answer your reflection is that the dictatorship of Franco was long, too long. And there were generations that they didn't know anything else. Franco, that's all. And Franco, what is a republic? No, it was a kingdom but without king, while Franco was alive. And it's true, the monarchy came because it was an instauration. It wasn't a restoration. It was an instauration imposed by Franco. And the question is now, what do we have to do with the monarchy? We have to break up with the monarchy because Franco many years ago imposed it or not. And in that way, the memory problem linked with the political problems. And mainly when you spread the concept of victims, because and no one has answered why there is a victim. A victim is a relative of a victim till fourth degree. Fourth degree is too much. So there are people born during the 80s, during the 90s, even people that has now 15 years or 16 years old, and they are victims from a legal point of view. And it's not clear at all why they have done this and what are the consequences of the spreading of this concept of victims.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, yes. Well, thank you indeed for the exchange of this expertise on how conceptually it's really difficult, to grasp the full complexity of who is the victim, who is the victimizer, blaming. Yes, indeed. Please, any other questions to Julio, please? Right. You see, I'm being tempted. I don't know, but perhaps you may even think this is kind of irrelevant. But see, Julio, I'm kind of tempted to quote José Ortega y Gasset, famous phrase, Spain is a nightmare of divides. Europe is an answer. Julio, what would you think? European studies, I mean, if we apply holistic European studies perspective to study Franco, as a contested legacy, would that be kind of added value to your national? Yes. Yeah. What's your thoughts on that? European perspective, whatever it means conceptually, on mnemonic warfare over Franco.
Yeah. Well, the Europeism and that phrase of José Ortega y Gasset, no, Spain is the problem and Europe is the solution. It has been even today, it's for us a strong feeling and a strong idea. But it's interesting because for the perception we have in Spain, that is most of the benefits and most of the good things that we have had during the democratic regime come from our own effort, but it's important to be in the NATO and mainly in the European Union. It is very clear in that. But it's curious, we have a sort of divorce of the concept Europe and the concept of memory and traumas of the past. Probably it's because we have an ideal image of Europe. Europe is the fantastic place where everything works good. And even the different governments, when a president has to take a delicate measure, well, as in Europe, I'm doing as in Europe, or Brussels told me, which is very, because we don't discuss something that comes from Europe. In Europe, well, we know that there was a Second World War, but we think, and a lot of politicians say the same thing here, there's no problem of memory in Europe. Germany have solved his problem. Italy have solved his memory problem. And we didn't have solved a memory problem. So there is a sort of victimism, own victimism of Spain as a country that has not been able to tackle with the past. Even Argentina. In Argentina, they have solved the problems. In Chile, they have solved the problems, which is not true. But the perception and the narrative, the official narrative, is that in everywhere, more or less, the memory is a solved problem, but not in Spain. And that's the reason why we have to make a law. And this is good. The initiative is good, but by consensus.
Yes, you're absolutely right. First, you would need first to reconstruct, rework your own national history, and then, of course, relate that to European context. Yeah. Yes, and please.
I just wanted to make to make a short comment. Thank you very much, Julio, for this inspiring lecture, and just commenting on what you've said. Now there is a book by a Polish journalist, Katarzyna Kobylarczyk, wrote in Polish, entitled Strób, Hiszpania rozdrapuje rany, which could be translated as Scrap, Spain scratches the wounds. And the first phrase of the synopsis of this book is as following: 80 years after the end of the civil war, Spain still does not know what to do with the bodies of the victims. Yeah. So as what you said, the focus nowadays is more on the dead people and relatives of the dead people than on survivors of the Francoism period, right?
Yeah.
And even Polish journalists, that this book is interesting, although it's showing more, it's one-sided. I mean, it's showing only the Republican victims part, of the history. And this personal attitude, because she's talking to people, to families who lost their relatives there. But it's another one example of what you said. Where's the focus nowadays in the politics?
Yeah, it's true. The problem is that we have mass graves caused by the nationalists, but caused also by the Republicans. So, what do we have to do? What do we have to do with this amount of bones and skulls and so on? I remember that some years ago, a committee of historians were consulted about it. And at that time, and it's still my opinion, I think that the best thing is to install a plaque or a monolito or a monument with the names of everybody. Reds, blues, everybody, and in each village, in each town, because you can recover some bones, but you cannot recover all the bones. There are skull and bones in Morocco. There are skull and bones destroyed by the pass of the time. So it's not as simple as my grandpa is in the ditch, I go to the ditch and I take it. One example, the famous writer García Lorca. García Lorca, they thought that the grave of Lorca is here. Ian Gibson, he said, is here, we have to take the bones and the remains of García Lorca. The family were opposed to it. But Ian Gibson, no, and the Memory Association, no, we have to take them because Lorca, he doesn't belong to the family, he belongs to the country, you know. And when they opened the ground, they didn't find anything. So it's very, very complicated so I think it's impossible to recover the bones and the skulls after a war, the Second World War, the disembark of the D-Day, or the Spanish Civil War. Is quite complicated, but we can do something in terms of memory, studying the names, recovering the names and the surnames of the people that died or were killed or whatever. Even the people that were killed were victims after being victimizers, which is another point. During the Civil War, there were victims, okay, but they were victimizers before. And even there were victimizers that were victims. So it's a complex world. And anyway, I think that any kind of measure to be taken should be taken, under my point of view, by consensus, by a wide consensus.
Indeed, yes. I've got the impression that we may slowly conclude our fascinating, afternoon. Yes, and I believe we are all looking forward to, Julio, to your written contribution, on this topic, one way or another. And having said that, Joanna, yes, I would now please ask you to formally conclude our afternoon session, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Grzegorz. Thank you for your reflections, contributions, very interesting questions, especially thanks to Professor Ponce for Julio for very inspiring lecture. I'd like to remind you that our next lecture will take place in January, on Tuesday, 24th of January. It will be given by Professor Focardi from University of Padua, and we will focus on Mussolini's contested legacies and Italian memory laws. And now I'd like to wish you a Merry Christmas and all the best in the new year 2023. And thank you for joining our lecture.
Thank you and bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much and Happy New Year. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas.